Hello, my name is Emmanuel Sakaias and you're watching Media IQ, the weekly program that interviews professionals, students and academics in the media industry to give you an insider's observation of how the news goes from the newsroom to your living room. Specifically today, we will be talking about the increasing tabloidisation of news media, the increasing prominence of first world news in the developed first world, and media regulation. Does it work? If so, can it be implemented?
Marius Kloppers, the head of BHP, as we know now, did not say that it had anything to do with the carbon tax or the mining tax. He said it was about capital costs and the rising Australian dollar. Have you now read that report, that BHP report?
And I had read BHP's statement at 3:45.
So why did you tell Lee Sales on the 7:30 report that you hadn't read it?
Well, Lisa, I was denying something that was being attributed to Marius Kloppers. I wasn't actually saying I hadn't read it because I had read it.
But that was a direct question that she asked you. She said, have you read the report? And you said no.
If you hadn't already seen it, that was Channel 9's Lisa Wilkinson grilling opposition leader Tony Abbott on a comment he had made earlier in the week in regards to the BHP Bulletin Plan. What I do want to point out is, even though it wasn't a morning show, it was probably one of the most hard-hitting aspects of the whole day and was largely circulated and talked about in the mainstream media. The question we beg is, why isn't this a more frequent occurrence? We see that constantly in the media, soft stories or sensationalized tabloid news. Why is this so? Why does this continually occur? I asked some of the University of New South Wales Media Department students to see their take on it. Here's what they had to say.
The global media industry is dominated not only by news but by entertainment as well, and what a lot of people don't realise is that the same guys who dominate the entertainment industry are the guys who dominate the news industry as well. And so there's a little bit of cross-pollination in a way. And our obsession as a culture in entertainment news, I think, is what sends us through to first world countries as well.
The audience wants to hear about it and they get that information and then they want to know more, because the media is obviously going to latch onto those things that are most hard-hitting, talk about Katie Holmes and Tom Cruise, for example, getting divorced. They want to know what the audience wants to know what the next instalment is in that. So by selecting the news and giving the audience what they want, it kind of self-perpetuates in the sense that the audience wants to know more.
Hard-hitting journalism is almost dying. There are some amazing journalists out there that are getting ignored, or people just, you know, they are getting published or they are on TV and people just aren't viewing it as much as they should be. I think the biggest thing for me with, you know, news coverage is the sensationalism and the fact that we care about things that we should not care about. We care about celebrities and we care about who cheated on who or who's getting divorced from who, and I think it's crazy. You know, I turned on the TV a couple of months ago and all I could see was Tom and Katie for about a week, and then they bounce off that into like other stories that are irrelevant. I think they printed a news story on the Sydney Morning Herald concerning Scientology after they started with Tom and Katie and then went on to other celebrities, of a 10-year-old story, you know, of something that completely unrelated just because the word Scientology could be implemented somewhere in there.
I later spoke to Maya Ivanovich after our interview had taken place, and she corrected her misuse of the term hard news. In fact, what she meant was it could gather a greater audience. It is interesting to note the students' observations of the media industry as to who creates the demand for the sensationalist content. Not to say that all news is sensationalistic, but the vast majority of it is, as stated by the students previously. I spoke to Dr. Peter White on his research into this matter. His expertise, which spans over 25 years, can give a little bit of an insight into it. After that, we'll have a lot more from the students.
So that's the perennial question. What is it the role of the media to sort of educate and dictate where an audience's interests should be, or is it their role to have a sensitivity to where the audience's interests are and to cater for that? I mean, I think that to note the notion that the media should somehow be ahead of its audience, should be doing this kind of public service of education isn't a simple one. It's a challenge, because who decides? Who decides as to what the audience should be interested in, where their perspective should be?
it's really hard to steer away from the fact that news media corporations are driven by consumers. And so whatever the consumer wants is what news media organisations have to deliver. It's difficult because traditionally they're supposed to have the responsibility of setting the news agenda, and they're supposed to be the ones who tell the consumers, the audience, what is happening around the world, but so much of the time the audience is interested in that.
A parliamentary showdown in store as both sides of politics go on the attack over Utegate.
What you just saw was Channel 9's 2009 coverage of the so-called Utegate scandal, which rocked federal politics between the then former opposition leader Malcolm Turnbull and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. It is interesting to note how the mass media attaches itself to certain stories by sensationalising them, by attaching the suffix gate, and thus by doing that, attaining an audience. This isn't, however, a new thing, as the suffix gate has been used to describe almost anything marginally related to scandal in recent times. This is largely due to viewers and/or readers of the media being very responsive to such stories. It is well known that a scandalous story sells more than a dull one, and it is this increasing want and simultaneous production of so-called infotainment news. Media corporations publish something small, apply spin, and churn it out as news. Alongside Utegate, the media has churned out Wormgate, Sirengate, and most recently, Bananagate, to name a few. Through doing this, audiences and readers of news are receiving an introspective view of the news, with overhyped, spun-up stories taking place of proper non-sensational affairs, especially on a global scale. On July 31, 2012, BBC News reported over 600 million people were without power in India due to a power grid failure. This left schools, hospitals, and all public areas without electricity across the country. This event was not published in either of New South Wales' major daily newspapers. To their credit, however, both Fairfax Media and News Limited publications published online editions of the story, providing vivid images of the situation. Now Professors Dr. Peter White and Dr. Colin Chua of New South Wales will explain why they believe this occurred.
If you think about Australia and how it's positioned geopolitically, Australia's always affiliated itself with Western countries. And as you read the news, as you look at Australia's history, this has always been a somewhat contentious perspective and position to take because of where Australia actually is in relation to its Asian neighbours. But when you look at news and the type of news that we watch based on Australia's geopolitical affiliations and its cultural affiliations, it's really not that surprising to see news skewed towards events in the West.
The mainstream media have always understood the audience to be interested in a fairly narrow array of countries and localities. They've seen that they've felt that their focus should be on those places where they assume their viewers and readers will feel a cultural, family connection. I have been reading newspapers since I was a youngster. I've had a lifelong interest in newspapers, and certainly that is an impression that I have. What would be the obvious reasons for that? Well, the obvious explanation is that this is done in pursuit of readers. Clearly, newspapers have had increasing competition from other sources of news or news-related information, and one thing they have done to address that is to increase the quota of the so-called the tabloid, the softer news.
And Australia, culturally, economically, politically, has always had really close ties with America. So, it's only to be expected that we're going to see those stories. Whereas we're not going to see stories about, natural disasters in India, natural disasters, or even other kind of stories of human interests in China or in other parts of Southeast Asia, pretty much just for that particular reason. Those stories don't sell well and don't resonate with particular Australian audiences. So to that extent, they don't get shown.
But should that be the case? Should a story's potential capital gain be its only determining factor as to whether or not it should be published? This is where the question of media regulation comes into effect.
In a capitalist society, news media organisations need to survive through profit, and these profits are driven by market demand, they're driven by consumers. So I believe it's difficult to put tighter regulations on media organisations who are only supplying what the consumers want.
People are given what they want in the media, and I definitely, you know, believe that if people are entertained by it, they'll obviously want more, but ultimately the media have the power to shape what people find important. If you're not telling me about the massive blackout in India, I'm not really going to know about it unless I go out of my way to research these things, which most people aren't doing. So if I don't know about it, it's not going to interest me, and thus I'll care about something less important.
I do think media regulation can be useful, however at the same time it does kind of compromise that idea of the media as the fourth estate. If you kind of put limitations on the media and what they can talk about and what they should talk about and that sort of thing, and how they should talk about it, it kind of incites the idea that, you know, they're not fulfilling their watchdog role. But then at the same time, you know, you look at some of the tabloid focuses that some of the media has and you think that perhaps they should be ushered in a different direction.
I'm a little bit sceptical about all the concern over the recent media inquiries, not only in the UK but in Australia as well. I'm a little bit of the opinion that, and it sounds a little bit bad, but I feel as though media is, to use an analogy, a pet dog. So if we tighten the leash on it a little bit too much, it's going to choke and it's going to die. But in saying that, if we regulate it a little too loosely, then it's going to run away and it's not going to be able to be controlled or regulated, because it's going to be dominated internally by its own primitive instincts, if you may.
A good analogy there by Gus. Definitely something to think about. And that's all we have for today's edition. Thank you for joining us. I'll leave you now with where we first started off, with a hard-hitting interview between Mr. Tony Abbott and Lee Sales at the BHP Bulletin Report. I'm Emmanuel Sakayas, and this is Media IQ.
You're not seriously telling me, Lee, that the mining tax and the carbon tax have made Australia an easier place to invest in?
I'm going on the facts that Marius Kloppers said today when he was directly asked if the decision on Olympic Dam was affected by Australia's tax situation, and I'm going on the facts that are outlined in their results statement that they've issued. Have you actually read BHP's statements?
No.